live. Okay, good morning. It is Monday. I am reading out of Joan Grant's book, So Moses Was Born. Joan Grant was a writer. She wrote books of her far memories. She was born in 1907 and she died in 1989. And this is the book about Moses. It is written from the view of Nebunefer in the 24th year of Ramoses II, and she describes the circumstances in the old Egypt before he was found. We are now at chapter, I think it is 12, I'm not exactly sure, I can't remember. It is all consecutively uploaded on my BitChute and my YouTube. The river. I knew it was futile to keep my thoughts secret from Sensen. Otherwise, I should not have shown her my letter from Ramoses. I expected her to be even more alarmed by it than I was myself. However, I should have known her better. I always thought Usermentu was evil, she said cheerfully. I hope he did the curse himself. Why? It seemed a reasonable question. Because it will be better for Moses to get rid of him than one of the other priests who isn't in Tua's confidence. I don't understand. Sensen sighed. Neb, aren't you being a little obtuse? Erie is safe here, so the curse will turn back on the person who put it on her. The idea of a curse bouncing back to the sender as though it were a checkerball thrown against the wall struck me as more than unlikely, but I pretended to agree with her. Do you think she will recover her sight at once? Asked Sensen. You must not be too hopeful. I'm inclined to think that User meant to notice that there was something wrong with her eyes and used it as an excuse to make his threats more convincing. Anyway, you must not let Erie guess there's anything odd about her disease. Sensen smiled. Neb, my love, you are as guileless as Ramoses. Tua made certain that all the Queen's women knew about Usermentu's prophecy, so that they were afraid to be nice to Erie. Of course, they told her about it with a wealth of detail. Then she ought to have left the palace months ago. She only stayed in the hope that Ramoses would conquer his fear of the priests until he could find a way of restoring the good ones to power. There are good priests, especially in the smaller temples, but he hasn't had a way of finding them yet. I found that the wound I had thought healed was still raw. I suppose what you really mean is that if I had only continued my temple training, instead of giving up before I reached even the first stage of initiation, I could still be real used to Egypt. Neb, don't be so touchy. You were perfectly right to tell Father about the horrible things they expected you to do. And he fully agreed. She shuddered. Fancy making a boy of 14 read chapters of the Book of the Dead by the light of a putrescent corpse. Of course it was evil. Usermentu maintained that it was done only to help the pupil overcome repugnance and so strengthen his will to pass the ordeals. You left the temple and married me. We are both very glad about it, so why worry about what would have happened if everything had been different? I knew her view was more robust than mine, but I wished that I could have been better equipped to protect the living water from Usermentu, should he breach our defenses. I've never been entirely sure whether Erie recovered her sight because the curse could not follow her into our sanctuary, or whether her happier environment produced a more ordinary cure. Within 7 days she did not need to cover her eyes, even in strong sunlight, and before she had been with us a month, Sensen was teaching her to do fine embroidery. I sent Hebrew to Ramoses with this encouraging news, and he returned to say that a certain person, whom I knew must be Usermentu, was suffering from a series of particularly painful boils. This may or may not have been coincidence, but it was inconclusive, for his eyes remained unaffected. A house was built close to our own for Eerie, and she lived there with Kia, whose husband came back with Hebu. Sensen made a close friend of her, and any regrets I may have had were soon dispelled by the pleasure the two found in each other's company. If Eerie wept for Ramoses, she did so in secret, and I began to hope that she would soon fall in love with one of the young men who tried to gain her favor. I sometimes left the living waters for a few days, usually with Passar, when he went to different villages to barter our products for the grain or wine, which we did not grow in sufficient quantity ourselves. It was on one of those occasions, when Eerie had been with us nearly 3 years, that I heard of a royal progress, in which Ramoses would pass upriver in the near future, on his way to inspect the progress of a great temple, which was being carved from the living rock at Nubit, near the sandstone quarries. I shall never cease to regret that I mentioned this news to Sensen, though at the time it seemed a harmless topic of conversation. I ought to have known that Eerie's sudden gaiety was due to something more than the fond glances of Quen, the eldest son of the chief coppersmith. The boy was handsome and intelligent. He would make her an excellent husband. I even felt a little smug when she and Sensen informed me that they had exciting news to impart. My benign thoughts of suitable wedding gifts were abruptly scattered by Sensen's opening remark. Eerie and I have decided that you are to take us to watch the progress. I made excuses, but even to me they sounded unconvincing. He's afraid that Usamento will attack me again, said Eerie, and her shoulders drooped with a weight of disappointment. Nonsense. Sensen frowned at me over Eerie's head. We stay here because it is so much nicer than anywhere else, but if we dared not go outside when we should be no better than prisoners. I took Sensen's cue reluctantly. If you both want to go, I have no real objection. I only thought it would be rather tiresome for you. The inns are most unsuitable, so we shall have to camp in the wadi. I like camping, said Sensen firmly, before Eerie could protest, as I knew she would, that he did not want to cause any inconvenience. Eerie and I want to see the new queen. It is said that she and Nefertari get on quite well together and are nice to each other's babies. Ramoses' second queen was a subject I had carefully avoided discussing either with Sensen or Eerie. He had sent me several letters by Hebu, but had taken no notice of my advice. Nefertari had accused him of deliberately murdering her child, and for several months had refused to allow him to give her another. Asnifert had been one of the queen's women, though not until Eerie had left the court, and it was much in her favor that, though she became first a concubine and later a queen, she was instrumental in reconciling Nefertari and her husband without losing the respect or affection of either. Sensen said, I suppose that Nefertari, being the great royal wife, still gives her a comfortable advantage over Astnefert, even though she has only one child to Astnefert's 2. Will the queen be with Ramoses? Poor Eerie, she tried so hard to sound as though she were unconcerned. I told her that as Astnefer's son was only 2 months old, she would probably stay with him in Heliopolis. I also pointed out that we should only see Ramoses in the distance, even if we forced our way to the front of the crowd. But Sensen had made up her mind that if Eerie saw Ramoses again, she would realize he was no longer a part of her life, and would turn to Quen for happiness. So what could I do but give my consent when Sensen sat on my knee and beguiled me? I tried to put off my sense of foreboding. What could be more natural than 2 women should be excited at a break in the placid routine of their lives? Surely I was not afraid that the sight of a progress would make the living waters seem circumscribed or even a little dull. Or was it the sight of Ramoses with his children that I feared? I dreamt of Usamento, but only as I had often seen him, walking with his hands hidden in the sleeves of his robes, his shaven head gleaming as though the skull shone through the yellow skin. I almost convinced myself that his curse was no more than another priestly trick by which the uninitiated are held subservient. Surely the dream was no more than the rotting shreds of an old fear from which I had fled without daring to give it decent burial. Because my consent had been grudging, I tried to make amends by suggesting that instead of watching the progress from the nearest village, where we should only have seen the barges pass in midstream, we should go to a town where Moses would speak to the assembled people. I sent Hebu and Quen ahead with the portable pavilions, which I had made the previous year so that I could take Sensen with me when we went to the hills, a day's journey by chariot, where I pastured some of our goats in the early spring. Each pavilion was light enough to be carried by 2 pack donkeys, for the framework was of acacia wood poles, which could easily be taken apart for transport. The hangings were wool, except on the 4th side, where a gaze curtain let in air, but kept out moths and biting flies, which were particularly troublesome during the inundation or before one of our rare thunderstorms. I had considered taking Sensen and Erie in a chariot, but then decided that an ox cart would be more appropriate to the clothes we intended to wear, which would be suitable to the family of a moderately prosperous farmer. I knew the town, for I had already been there with Passar, so I had no difficulty in finding the place where Hebu had made our camp. It was near a well, but secluded from the main highway by a grove of Persia trees, which, being evergreen, afforded pleasant shade even so early in the year. Quen had found food ready for us, and after we had eaten, Sensen announced that she was going to bed, so that we should be able to find good places on the waterfront soon after dawn. I made a mild protest that we need not get there so early, for the progress was not until noon, but the mist was still rising from the river when we reached the marketplace. Many of the people must have been travelling through the night, for they were still streaming in through the town gates. Every inn and beer shop was crowded, their yards filled with carts and chariots, while stable boys threw armfuls of fodder to the horses and oxen, or groomed them with wisps of straw. The houses, which formed 3 sides of a square that led to the quay, were decorated with swags of leaves and sheaves of green wheat. Masts flying yellow or scarlet pennants lined the principal streets, and at every corner stood a wine cellar, dipping one cupful after another from the jar beside him, while his rival poured sweet beer or syrup from a row of pitchers. Sensen pointed out that we had disguised ourselves too well. Women look at Erie and me with sympathy, thinking you might have been more generous on this famous occasion. Everyone else is wearing every necklace and bracelet she owns or could borrow. I took them to the booth which sold trinkets and bought them necklaces of faints beads, which Sensen said were much prettier blue than turquoise. Quen, emboldened by my example, gave Erie a copper anklet. We paused to watch acrobats and a juggler who conjured a quail chick from Hebu's ear. At the food stalls, we chose slices of goose wrapped in a napkin, 3-cornered rolls of bread sprinkled with poppy seeds, a jar of curds, and other honey. The crowd began to drift towards the quay, and we jostled our way forward so as to be in the forefront of spectators. I found good places for us, beside a heap of garlands which children would later throw before Pharaoh's barge. The poppies had begun to wilt, and scarlet petals trodden in the dust were bright as blood. I shivered as though the wind blew suddenly cold. Voices raised in the name of Pharaoh rippled towards us as the royal barge drew slowly into sight. The song in his honor swelled into an arc of sounds as though we were closed in a temple whose pillars were praise. The rowers slowed their rhythm, and eager hands caught the scarlet ropes that guided the barge towards us, proud as a swan. The steersman held up his hand for silence. Ramoses spoke to his people. I found myself deeply moved, for though reasons told me that his words were polished, smooth as rubbing stone by constant repetition, they sounded as though he spoke to each of us from the heart. Tears were running down Erie's face, yet she was smiling. "He looks happy," she said, so low that I knew she was speaking her thoughts aloud. "Now I know he's happy, I can make Quen happy too." Nefertari and Astnefert were in the second barge. They were smiling together, and each had a child on her knee. The eldest prince was trying to catch the shadows cast by the ostrich feathers which 6 fan-bearers waved above the raised platform, where the queen could be seen by the crowd. Nefertari took a lotus from her headdress and gave it to her son, helped him to wave it to the people, who shouted their pleasure. Astnefer's daughter, not to be outdone, held up her gold rattle, chuckling fatly. "Now, none of us need worry about Ramoses," said Sensen, yet her voice was wistful. "I wish we could ask him to come to the living water. It would be so good to talk with him again." "He is Pharaoh," said Eerie. "Only a queen can really talk with Pharaoh." The rhythm keeper struck the silver gong which hung in the bow prow of the royal barge. The rowers leant to their oars. They quickened their stroke. Slowly the train of barges drew away, until the sun on the water was too bright for us to see them any longer. That night we joined the townspeople, who danced in the marketplace and ate and drank as Pharaoh's guests from the long tables which had been set up in the main street. It was dawn before we returned to our pavilion. Sensen was so sleepy that I had to guide her steps, and Eerie clung to Quen's hand as though she were afraid of being lost. I noticed that Eerie seemed very tired on our way home, but thought it was due to the unusual excitement. She went straight to her own house on her return, and I did not see her the following day. "It's odd that Eerie hasn't come to tell us about Quen," said Sensen. "She has promised to marry him, for he has told Passan in Hebrew. He awoke us in the middle of the night. Eerie is ill," she said. "She has a high fever, and when she breathes it sounds like dry palm leaves rattling in the wind." Sensen insisted on going to Eerie, though I tried to go alone. Eerie did not recognize us. She thought I was Ramoses and kept pleading with me to send her away before she brought danger to the palace. Sometimes she stared at the wall and seemed to see something which filled her with terror. Was it Usamento? I shall never be sure, though she cried out that the lamp was searing her eyes. Her skin felt brittle as dry grass. Her lips cracked with a heat that flailed the moisture from her parched body. We wrapped her in wet linen to try to bring her coolness, dropped wine through a hollow reed into her mouth, rubbed her with lion's fat to give strength to her wasted muscles. Sensen refused to leave her except when she was too exhausted to keep her heavy eyelids open. Even Quen had begun to lose all hope when, on the 10th day, there came a blessed change. Sweat began to pour from her, as though a spring had broken into a dry well. She recognized us and smiled, spoke like a child, saying she was hungry. She swallowed sips of milk mixed with raw egg and honey. Then she fell into a gentle sleep, holding Quen's hand. That night I slept a deep sleep, dark as bitumen. I was lost in a desert on a night without stars, yet a black sun blazed down on the torrid rocks in shafts of shadow cruel as charring brand. I tried to cry out, for Sensen was also lost and trying to reach me, but my tongue was just dry as stretched hide, powerless, as though my mouth were filled with a natron of embalmers. I struggled to escape from this black net of nightmare, forced open my eyelids. Had I cried out and frightened Sensen? I took her hand. It was hot as the sand of my desolate dream. I cannot write of the days and nights which followed. I was sustained by hope, because Eerie had survived this cruel ordeal. On the evening of the 9th day, Sensen Pillow was also drenched, but not with a beneficent sweet sweat of healing. As I raised her to ease the anguish which racked her lungs, blood gushed from her mouth. All through the night I held the body of my love in my arms, while her heart's blood slowly stiffened, until we were wrapped together in its scarlet shroud. That was sad ending. The next chapter is Master of Expediency. Have a lovely Monday.